Hello, my name's Rebecca and welcome to the video. This year I read 50 books and I narrowed it down to like 4 books I was super excited about, super stoked, would want to read them again, and then 3 books that I was like pretty disappointed by, whether it was just like hype in general or it was a type of book that I usually really like. But let's get started. The first book that I would definitely recommend, this book rips my heart out, put it back, ripped it out and put it back again. It made me cry like several times, and I'm not honest, I'm a crier, but I'm not usually like a book crier. But this book is The Stationery Shop. This book starts at least in 1950s Tehran with our main character Roya, who is a teenage girl, and she meets this cute political activist in a stationery shop named Batman, and they fall in love over poetry, books, and politics, but Batman's mother does not approve. So Batman and Roya decide to elope in the town square, but the day that they decide to elope, there is a coup that changes the country forever, and Roya and Batman never see each other again. Or maybe they do, but very later in life. But this story was just like so beautiful. It followed obviously this love story, but also other love stories and other heartbreaking stories, and kind of they all piece together. This one is great, but it will break you a little bit, but the end is not too heartbreaking, if that makes you feel better at all. But yes, highly recommend The Stationery Shop. The next book I would recommend is my favorite romance of the year. It is technically like a family drama plus romance, but the romance really blew it out of the water for me, at least. But this is a very typical family, and this is a story based in Santa Cruz, California, which is where I'm from, so that's probably influencing it a little bit. But our main character is on the East Coast. Her name's Natalie, and she hasn't been back to her hometown in Santa Cruz for 15 years since she did something that basically put her older sister and older brother in prison, and hasn't spoken to anyone in her family in that time. But her mother dies and they have to figure out the estate, and all the siblings have to be at the house in Santa Cruz. During this time, her older brother is a marine biologist in UC Santa Cruz, and they're trying to find him, and they use the help of his co-worker who's another marine biologist, and he and Natalie kind of have a romance, and they go all over and they talk about marine biology, and it's just like, I love it. I like romance plus like actual marine biology stuff. It's super great. They like go over to Monterey, and it's awesome. But yes, so that one I like. That was my favorite romance this year. This next book is my favorite nonfiction book of the year, and this book is a memoir about complex trauma and CPTSD, and this book is What My Bones Know. It's a pretty popular book, and I would highly recommend it if you are interested in mental health. I think this book does a really good job of looking at trauma through a cultural lens and also looking at it through an immigrant-informed lens. The author herself is an Asian woman, grew up in the Bay Area and had immigrant parents, so she has quite a different perspective than a lot of other authors of trauma books in the past. So I would really highly recommend this book. If you feel like you're in a place that you could read it, definitely look at the trigger warnings before you read this book. It was kind of a tough read, but if you feel like you're in a good, healthy place to read something like this, it's a great one to read. If you liked I'm Glad My Mom Died, it is a similar kind of book to that, but with more like research in it. My last favorite book of the year is my ultimate favorite book of the year. I'm actually gonna read the next book of the series coming up. But this book is a character-driven book about female friendship and class set in Italy. And this book is My Brilliant Friend. I absolutely love this book. The cover is terrible, but the book itself is amazing. I talk about this book in another video, but I absolutely adore this book. You really fall in love with the two main characters, who are girls who are navigating life in Italy. I want to say it's like I'm like forgetting the time. I think it's like 1950s, 1940s, in a small town that is pretty poor, and how they kind of deal with that. And both girls kind of go down two different paths but do remain friends. And you also kind of get into like the dynamics of this like small town, which I love, of like, okay, what are like the dynamics between all of these characters in this town, and how does that look from like the lens of these like young girls who like don't really understand adult complex relationships. So I really, really, really love this book. If you are a character-driven girly like me, you would love this book. It doesn't have like a ton of plot, but it has enough plot, so it's great. I loved it. Now we're in the books that were flops, really disappointed me. But the first book that I'm going to talk about is a book that is on a topic that like I'm really interested in. I think there's like a lot of potential. Like, I feel like I could have written maybe a better book. I don't know. But this book is Momfluenced, and it's basically a book about mommy influencers and kind of like the history of that and the social impact supposedly of that, how it impacts you, your self-esteem, and that kind of stuff. I had kind of two issues, maybe three issues with this book. Number one, though, she really didn't talk about the impact of, you know, family channels or like mom influencers or whatever on the children themselves, which I was really surprised about. I think she might have mentioned it for like a page or two at like the end of the book, but there's so much information there, like there's so much potential there, and I think that's actually like probably the biggest harm. She really just talked about like how mom influencers impact like self-esteem of moms, which is definitely an issue, and I think it's an issue, you know, that should be talked about. But it was like a glaringly obvious thing that she was not talking about how it's impacting kids at all. It was really odd to me, and I think the reason is that she like is friends or wants to be friends with some of these mom influencers, because it felt very much sort of like these mom influencers are bad, but these are the ones you should follow instead, and these ones are amazing. And she just kept on like naming and like having a page about like each of these mom influencers that you should follow instead, which felt really odd to me, and I felt really biased. Like her solution to these problems was like mom influencers should be like more diverse, which is like, I guess, like, you know, a mom influencer who's like kind of messy or who's like black or whatever. I don't think that's really gonna like solve the main issue of this problem. And my next issue, which was not as big of an issue, but I just felt like it was a little sloppy, was that it wasn't clear at all like who her audience was for. If it was for like just moms, which kind of seemed like how she was writing, then she should have made that more clear. If it was just for moms, that's totally fine, and I think I would have read it in a different kind of way. I also think she could have added some information about like what other people are doing in terms of like how much of their kids they're showing and like what they're kind of doing. Are they like, you know, some people put like emojis on faces, and some people like only show this or that, or like don't show like where they go to school, or, you know, whatever. There's like a lot of things that you can do and a lot of tips that would probably be helpful for parents. And if it was for, you know, a broader audience, I feel like it was very mom specific. Like it felt really like she wasn't showing a lot of perspectives of like other people, and I felt like that was really like lacking in this book. Yeah, I didn't get a lot from this book. I could have just watched a YouTube video. So if you're interested in this and you wanted to read this book, I would just honestly watch a YouTube video about like mom influencers instead, because you'll get more out of it. This next one, I'm a little nervous. I might get some mean comments because it's very popular. The book that disappointed me was Fourth Wing. It was so hyped up and just really fell flat for me. I felt like the characters were not really there at all. But if you haven't heard of Fourth Wing, this book is like a romance fantasy book, and the main character's name is Violet. In this world, you can kind of be different careers, but at a particular age, you kind of have to decide and go to the school for that career. And she has been set up basically since she was small. She's wanted to be a scribe. But at the last minute, her mom, who is in the military basically, decides she has to be in the military, has to join this dragon school. And this book is kind of like, in some ways, like Squid Games in the terms of the amount of death there is. Like the first challenge just to get into the school, like 50% of the people die, like straight up die. People have talked about this book, so I won't go on and on and on about it, but I do feel like it relied too much on tropes. The pacing was weird, specifically with like death and then like sexual tension and romance. Like that happened like too close together for my taste. And I just didn't really understand the like motivations of a lot of the characters. The last book that was disappointing for me was The Last Housewife, and this book is about a rich housewife who learns that her old best friend from college has been murdered in her college town, goes back to her college town to investigate this cult that they were both in college, and kind of explores that. And I was like, oh, that's amazing. Cults, rich housewives, that murder, amazing. This is like made for me. I'll definitely like this book. I did not like this book. I think that premise, great. When we go back to like college times and like how they joined the cult and the cult itself, the reason why the characters are like stuck in the cult or stuck in the situation or joined in the first place, like doesn't really make any sense at all. Like there's a lot of research that the author could have looked into of like how people get into cults, like what happens, like what is that progression, and that was not in here at all. Like it didn't, I was like, this is not, you don't, yeah, I don't want to give too much away, but I'm like, that's just not how this happens. Like this is not what happens. There was also too much essay and abuse for my taste, at least, and the cult itself. Like I was like, oh, this is like this is less of a cult and more of like a weird incel thing. So yeah, if you want to read about incels, maybe. Just felt like it was written by a man, but it was written by a woman. Thank you so much for watching and getting to this point, and here's to 2024.